The fluorescent light above bed 14 flickered twice, the way they always did around 0300, as if the whole ward was fighting the same battle against exhaustion that Simone Bianchi had been quietly losing for the last 6 years. She was standing at the medication cart, her back to the nurse's station, drawing up a heparin flush with the practiced economy of a woman who had done this 10,000 times, not 10,000 like a mantra, counted one by one in VA wards and trauma tents and places that didn't have names on any map you could find in a library. The needle caught the light. She depressed the plunger a fraction, watching for the bubble. There was none. There never was. She capped it, labeled it, placed it in the tray in exactly the right order, and turned around. "Doctor?" Marcus Holt was standing in the doorway of the break room, watching her with that particular expression she had learned to recognize and absorb without reaction. The expression of a man who assumed she was doing something wrong but couldn't figure out exactly. Holt was 31 years old. He had done his residency at Johns Hopkins, and he brought it up at least 3 times a week with the casual frequency of a man who kept a trophy where his conscience should have been. He had good hair and soft hands, and the absolute certainty of someone who had never once in his professional life been genuinely afraid that his patient might die before his pager went off. "Those orders were placed an hour ago, Bianchi." He didn't say it loudly. He never raised his voice. He did something more efficient. He let the vowels go flat, the way you'd speak to a cafeteria worker who had given you the wrong side dish. "The patient in 14 has been asking for his anticoagulant since shift change. Mr. Delgado's heparin just finished its 12-hour window at 0240, Simone said. She didn't look up from the cart. She was already checking the secondary line with 2 fingers. If I'd pushed it at 0200 the way it was charted, his time in therapeutic range would have gone subtherapeutic by morning rounds. It's documented. A pause. The kind that meant he was deciding whether the math was right without wanting to admit he needed a moment to check it. Just make sure the chart reflects your reasoning. It does. I put a note in at 0218. He left. The break room door swung shut, and Simone let the small, practiced exhale leave her body and took the tray down the hall toward 14. This was her world. Ward 7 Bravo, Building 12, Haley Veterans Affairs Medical Center, Tampa. Cardiology, overflow, and vascular surgery. Recovery, mostly. Men and women in their 60s and 70s and sometimes 80s who had done things in places Simone understood on a molecular level, who smelled like mentholated balm and old coffee. She knew which ones would be up at 0300, unable to sleep. She knew which ones would be arguing about their discharge paperwork and which ones were scared and hiding it behind loud opinions about the television remote. She had been here for 6 years and 3 months. Before that, she had been somewhere else. Entirely. Mr. Delgado was 72 and had done 2 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry before the government discovered they could make better use of his particular combination of spatial intelligence and disregard for his own safety in a capacity that remained classified. He never talked about the classified part. He talked about the 1st Cav the same way you talk about a car you loved when you were 19, fondly, with the precise kind of retrospective affection that can only exist at a safe distance from the actual thing. "You always do that," he said as she came in with a tray. "Do what?" "Check the tube before you cap it." "I watch you do it every time." He was sitting up in the hospital bed with the light on, which meant he'd been awake for a while. His IV site was on the back of his left hand, and it was clean. No infiltration, which she checked first thing before she touched anything else. "Old habit from where?" Simone swabbed the port attached the flush syringe with a quarter turn, checked the line for resistance. "From nursing school," she said. Delgado made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You know, I've been a patient here 4 times in 4 years, and I've had maybe 50 nurses. You're the only one who always knows what the labs are going to show before they come back. The labs just confirm what the patient already told me. My patient told you his APT was going to be 68. Your capillary refill told me the color of your palms. The fact that you've been rubbing your left thumb against your index finger for the last 2 days, like there's a catch in the joint that wasn't there before." She locked the cap back on the port, smoothed the tape on his IV with one thumb, clicked the light to dim microemboli, not clinical yet, but trending. I flagged it for rounds. He watched her move to the call board to update his chart entries. "Where were you before here?" Delgado asked, and there was something careful in the question, the tone of a man who has spent decades noticing the things that other people don't say. "Tampa General. Before that, some contract work." She didn't turn around. "Try to sleep, Mr. Delgado. You've got an echo at 0800. She left before he could ask anything else. The things they said about Simone Bianchi on 7 Bravo were said in the particular low register that people use when they're not quite gossiping and not quite complaining, but occupying the ambiguous middle ground between the two. Holt said she was overcautious and it slowed things down. He said it to other residents, not to the attending physicians, which meant he understood on some level that the attending physicians didn't agree with him. Yolanda Ferris, the chief of vascular surgery on 7 Bravo, had told a nurse manager named Kevin 2 months ago that Simone Bianchi was the best clinician on this floor and possibly in this building, and Kevin had written it in his notes and then lost the notes. The new travel nurses found her standoffish. She didn't join the birthday parties in the break room or participate in the March Madness bracket. She ate her lunch at the medication cart if she ate lunch at all. Her badge photo showed a woman with close-cropped dark hair and pale gray eyes, and the expression of someone who had agreed to the photograph as a bureaucratic necessity and not a moment of vanity. She was 34 years old and looked like she could be 40 in a certain light and 28 in another. She had 2 things people noticed about her. She never dropped anything, and she never startled. Both of those things were harder to explain than they sounded. The not dropping was the one that made the new nurses feel incompetent. Simone moved through a crowded ward during a code without ever colliding with another person, without ever fumbling a piece of equipment, without wasting motion. Her hands, when she was working, did exactly what she intended them to do, and nothing else. An IV in a patient with profound vascular disease and rolling veins, the kind that made even experienced nurses sweat quietly for 3 attempts. Simone hit first time without looking like she was concentrating particularly hard. The not startling was stranger, and the staff had started to notice it without quite being able to articulate what they were noticing. When an alarm went off unexpectedly behind her, Simone didn't flinch. When someone dropped a tray in the hallway, she turned toward the sound, but her shoulders didn't jump. When a patient in the next room had screamed during a dressing change, a loud, sudden, raw scream that had sent the tech in the hallway backward into the wall, Simone had already been moving toward the room with her hand on the door handle. Dr. Holt said she was unsympathetic because she didn't perform enough visible distress when patients were in pain. He said this to the charge nurse, who said nothing back, because the charge nurse had watched Simone spend 40 minutes after the end of a 12-hour shift sitting with a Korean War veteran who was afraid to go home to an empty house. And she had filed that away in the part of her brain where she kept the things that told her more about a person than anything else, Nobody knew where Simone had done her contract work before Tampa. Her HR files said Southeastern Regional Medical and a staffing agency called Coastal Healthcare Partners, LLC, which existed and was real and had employed exactly the number of people you'd expect a small staffing agency to employ. Nobody had looked harder than that. Nobody had looked harder than that, because looking harder than that required a reason, and the reason didn't exist yet. 48 hours before General Raymond Coates and his VIP entourage walked onto 7 Bravo, Simone had a shift she would not have described as particularly difficult, and that other nurses would have described as insane. It started at 0600 with a patient in post-op room 3 going into respiratory distress following what was supposed to be a routine aortoiliac bypass. The on-call resident got there in 6 minutes, which was good. But in those 6 minutes, Simone had already positioned the patient, assessed his oxygen saturation, identified the crackles in his left base that suggested a pleural effusion building from the overnight IV fluids, and begun the documentation with the timestamp that would matter later if anyone needed to reconstruct the clinical timeline, when the resident arrived and said, "What have we got?" Simone handed him a single note card with the vitals, the saturation curve over the last 22 minutes, and her differential in bullet points. The resident, a good one, 2nd year, named Priya Anand, looked at the note card and said, "You paged the thoracic, attending, paged at 06. 07. She's 7 minutes out." You knew it was a pleural effusion before you paged. I heard it when I repositioned him. The dullness on percussion at the left base. "How long have you?" Priya stopped herself. She had been about to ask how long Simone had been a nurse, and had apparently decided it was a question she didn't need answered in the next 30 seconds. "Good catch," she said instead, and went to work. By 0900, Simone had managed a wound dehiscence in post-op room 6, walked a diabetic veteran through a hypoglycemic episode without spiking his anxiety by keeping her voice at a register that was somehow both urgent and unhurried, the tone of a person who knows the situation is manageable and communicates that certainty through physics as much as words, and caught a medication error in the 12 o'clock dispensary before it reached the patient. The medication error was a heparin concentration mix-up, the kind of thing that ended careers if it reached a patient. She found it because she had a habit of cross-referencing the concentration on the bag against the ordered dose against the patient's weight before she touched the IV tubing, which was not technically a required step in the existing protocol and which Simone had never been asked to add as a protocol step. About it had never noticed her doing it. She reported it to pharmacy, filled out the incident form in 4 minutes, and moved on to room 12 before anyone had processed what had almost happened. Holt found out about the incident report at 1100 and came to find her at the medication cart. "Pharmacy is saying you flagged a heparin concentration discrepancy." "Yes, that should have gone through charge first. The protocol says, report to pharmacy directly for anticoagulant discrepancies and notify charge concurrent. I notified Kevin at 0947. She pointed at the timestamp on her notes app without being asked. "I didn't make a pharmacy decision. I identified a discrepancy and reported it." He looked at her with a flat-voweled expression. "I want to review the incident form." "Of course," Simone said, and went back to the medication cart, and he went away. Kevin, the charge nurse, found her at lunch, the 20-minute version she ate standing at the cart, and said quietly, not making a production of it, "You probably saved that man's life this morning. The heparin thing. You're not going to say anything? I put it in the incident report. Kevin studied her for a moment. Do you ever get rattled? He said. Not where patients can see me, Simone said, and that was all she said about it. The VIP tour notification came down through the administrative channels on a Tuesday morning and arrived on 7 Bravo as a laminated memo on the break room door that Kevin read aloud to the assembled nursing staff with the mix of excitement. General Raymond Coates, United States Army, retired, was conducting a goodwill and inspection tour of free VA facilities in the Southeast as part of a Department of Veterans Affairs advocacy initiative. The tour group would include General Coates, his aide, a VA public affairs officer, 2 representatives from the Senate Armed Services Committee, and a photographer from a veterans advocacy nonprofit. They would be on 7 Bravo for approximately 45 minutes on Thursday at 1400. Ward Administrator, Dr. Elizabeth Price sent a follow-up email asking that the ward be tidy and operationally orderly, which Kevin said meant she wanted it to look like nobody was ever actually sick here, and that all nursing staff should be in clean scrubs and prepared to interact professionally and warmly with the visiting delegation. Dr. Holt responded to the email by saying he would be prepared to provide an overview of the ward's clinical outcomes data, which Kevin interpreted as meaning he planned to talk for most of the 45 minutes if nobody stopped him. Simone read the memo once. She noted the general's name. She noted the time. She went back to work. Thursday arrived with the particular quality that Tampa days in spring have, which is to say bright and beginning to be humid and entirely indifferent to what was happening inside the air-conditioned white buildings where people were trying to stay alive. By 13:30, the ward had been straightened with the performance quality of a theater troupe preparing for opening night. Kevin had borrowed a mop bucket from the floor below. The supply cart in the hallway had been pushed 6 inches to the left, so it was flush with the wall. Simone finished the 1300 medication pass and started her documentation. She was wearing the same kind of scrubs she wore every day, navy blue, her hospital ID badge clipped to the left pocket, her hair pulled back in the way it always was, practical and severe. She had not thought about adjusting anything for the visit. At 13:42, Holt materialized at her elbow. When the tour group comes through, let me do the talking on the clinical side. Patient information, outcomes, that kind of thing. You can field questions about day-to-day nursing operations if they come up. Simone typed a note into the chart she was working on. Okay. It's not that your input isn't valuable, Marcus, she said, which was the first time she had used his first name in 6 years. She said it the way you say a word that ends a sentence. I understand. He left. Kevin appeared a moment later with the expression of a man who has heard too much and decided to focus on something practical. The tour group is coming up in the elevator at 1400, he said. I need somebody to stay available on the floor for patient issues while the main group does the walkthrough with Holt and Price. I'll stay on the floor, Simone said. Kevin looked relieved. Perfect. You're the best person for. He caught her expression and stopped. Okay, yes, thank you. At 1401, the elevator doors opened and the tour group came onto 7 Bravo. The way tour groups enter places, a little too wide for the space moving with the specific, collective gait of people who are performing a version of being comfortable. Dr. Price was in front. Holt was at her shoulder. The public affairs officer, young with a lanyard full of credentials, was making notes on a tablet. The 2 Senate staffers were looking around, with the careful expression of people trying to decide what the story here was. The photographer was moving already, slow and sideways, the way good photographers do, looking for the frame before committing to it. And General Raymond Coates. He was 64 and looked like someone had assembled him from the materials that endure. He was broad through the shoulders, in the way that men are broad when the muscle is old and structural, not decorative. He wore civilian clothes, pressed khakis, a dark blue blazer, an American flag lapel pin, and he moved with the economy of someone who had stopped needing to demonstrate that he was comfortable anywhere. His hair was silver white and close cropped, and his face had the particular weathered quality of a man who had spent a substantial portion of his life outdoors in conditions that were not designed to be gentle to the human face. His aide was a captain in her late 20s, walking a half-step behind him and slightly to his left, which was where aides walk when they are very good at their jobs. Dr. Price began the tour. She gestured down the corridor. She said the words that were in her mental notes: patient census, bed capacity, veteran population served, outcomes trajectory over the last fiscal year. Holt stepped in with the clinical data. He was good at this part, Simone had to admit. From a purely technical standpoint. He could make numbers sound like a story, and he knew how to modulate his voice so the room leaned in. Simone was 60 feet away at the far end of the corridor, at the medication cart, with a view of the whole hallway and the back of the tour group. She was reviewing the afternoon lab results for the 3 patients she was watching most carefully. She did not look up much, but she heard something she was not expecting to hear. Coates's voice had a particular texture, a bass register, with a slight, deliberate quality that military commanders develop over years of being the person in a room whose words need to be heard clearly the first time without repetition. She had heard 100 voices like it, and none of them were strange to her. That was not what stopped her. What stopped her was that he used the word night infiltration casually. The way you use a term that is simply part of your vocabulary, in a sentence to one of the Senate staffers about a program he'd administered. And in the specific way he said it, with no inflection at all, because it needed none. Simone's internal compass did the thing it did when a piece of data didn't fit the ambient context. Coates was facing away from her. He was talking to the Senate staffers. Dr. Price was smiling. Holt was waiting for his next cue. Simone looked at the set of his shoulders. She looked at the specific way he held the right side of his jaw, not tension, but the residual artifact of a man who had worn a helmet for decades and developed a particular way of sitting in the muscle beneath his ear that she had seen before. She looked back at her labs. She stayed with the labs for approximately 45 seconds. Then she looked up again. The tour group was moving toward the nursing station, which was toward her. Coates was now in 3/4 profile, listening to something the public affairs officer was saying, nodding without particularly indicating that he was interested. And then he turned his head, the way you turn your head when you've been in enough rooms, with enough exits to always be aware of all of them, and he was facing the long corridor of 7 Bravo, and he was facing the medication cart. She saw it happen. She watched it happen with the same detached clinical precision with which she watched an EKG. Strip change character, the exact moment when the pattern shifted from baseline to... It moved through Coates the way a current moves through water. His face did not rearrange itself dramatically. His voice did not stop. His body did not recoil. He was a man who had spent 34 years at the highest levels of Special Operations Command, and he had long ago built a discipline over his own reactions that was nearly impenetrable from the outside. Simone had spent 4 years operating in units that worked with 160th SOAR, the Army's Special Operations Aviation Regiment. the ones everyone called night stalkers because they owned the night and the people who flew with them, the stillness that was not really stillness, the micro-deceleration of the walking gait when the brain received information it needed 3 seconds to process, the way the eyes pulled focus and didn't release it. The question was, which version of her he thought he was seeing? She did not run. That impulse had been there once, and she had burned it out of herself through years of deliberate effort, because running was the kind of thing that turned a manageable situation into an unmanageable one. She stood at the medication cart, and she finished the entry she was typing, and she set the tablet down in precisely the same way she would have set it down if the tour group had contained no one she had ever encountered in any previous life. The tour group arrived at the nursing station. Dr. Price was talking about the electronic health record system and how the ward had improved documentation, compliance metrics. Holt was nodding. The photographer was taking a shot of the station from an angle that would make the workspace look clean and organized. Coates had stopped moving. His aide, the captain, the one who was good at her job, noticed he had stopped moving and paused beside him, looking at him with the quiet attentiveness of someone who has learned to wait for the signal. Coates was looking at Simone. Simone held his gaze. She had been holding it for 15 seconds. That felt like 15 minutes. She could feel the ward the way you feel a room when you're suddenly aware of every person in it. Holt, talking, Price, gesturing, Kevin at the station, the photographer, the 2 staffers, the aide, all of it present and peripheral and containing nothing that was more important than what was happening right now between this man and her. He crossed the corridor. Not fast. Not with the urgency that would have drawn attention. He moved the way he had always moved when the situation required presence over speed, with a deliberate, unhurried quality that commanded space without announcing itself. He stopped 8 feet from the medication cart. Holt had turned around. Now noticing the general had separated from the group, preparing to redirect, to reintegrate the narrative. General Coates, if you'd like to see the medication management protocol, nurse. Give me a moment, doctor, Coates said. 3 words. Not loud, not impolite, but with a finality that made Holt close his mouth and stay closed. Coates took 2 more steps toward Simone. He was close enough now that she could see the details she'd been watching from a distance. The jaw, the way the muscle beneath his ear sat in the specific groove she had clocked from 60 feet. She could see the eagle and stars of his retirement, pin on the lapel. She could see in the slight pallor of a man whose complexion had just processed a significant physiological shock that she was right about all of it. Your name, he said, and the question in it was not really a question. Simone Bianchi, she said. VA Medical, 7 Bravo. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes moved across her face with the focused, systematic quality of a man performing a positive ID under conditions where he was simultaneously highly confident and highly aware of what it meant if he was right. Quiet. Just between them. I left the 160th, Simone said. A long time ago you were reported. KIA. Southern Afghanistan, 2019. There was a lot of confusion in 2019. A compression of everything he had just computed, the operational implications, the personal implications, the institutional ones, into a single contained expression that a stranger would have read as nothing. Bianchi, he said, and now he was not asking. He was saying a name, the way you say a name when you find it in a place where you stopped looking for it. Sergeant Bianchi, flight medic. You have the wrong person, Simone said. She said it without heat. She said it the same way she'd told Holt the chart reflected her reasoning, with the flat, patient quality of a statement that was technically in the record and would have to be accepted as such. Coates didn't move. He looked at her the way he had looked at the corridor when he first came through the elevator, systematically, taking the exit and the threat, except the threat here was something he had not encountered in a prepared way, and the exit was somewhere he did not want to go. The board was very quiet, not hushed. It was still a hospital, still the ambient rhythm of machines and distant movement and the ventilation system pushing recycled air through the ceiling vents. But everyone in the immediate space had registered the quality of this interaction and had done what people do when they sense that something is happening that they don't have a framework for, which was to become very still and pay close attention. Holt was standing 6 feet back. His mouth was slightly open. The photographer had lowered the camera but not put it away. General Raymond Coates, United States Army retired, former commander of Special Operations Aviation Command. 3 combat deployments, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, a Silver Star he almost never mentioned, took a step back. And he came to attention. Not the performative attention of a ceremony, not the attention of a man executing a protocol, the attention of a man who has encountered something that demands it from the deepest part of whatever he is, the part that was formed, long before the rank, in some particular night over some particular terrain, where a 26-year-old flight medic had done something that meant he was still alive to retire, Tuesday in April to shake hands and look at clean medication carts. He raised his right hand to his brow, he held the salute, the aide made a sound that was not a word. Price put a hand over her mouth. The Senate staffers looked at each other. Kevin, at the nursing station, sat back in his chair and looked at Simone with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Holt said nothing. For once, simply and completely, Holt said nothing. Simone stood at the medication cart and felt the salute hit her the way physical things hit you, in the chest, in the sternum, in the place behind the clavicle where adrenaline lives, when it has nowhere else to go. She had not been saluted in 6 years. She had not been seen in 6 years. Not truly, not by anyone who knew what they were looking at. She was 34 years old, and she had been many things. She had been the youngest daughter of a machinist from Youngstown, Ohio, who had told her that women who were smart and strong and refused to accept smaller versions of themselves than they deserved would always find a place, but would usually have to make that place themselves. She had been a high school track star and a pre-med college dropout and an Army enlistee at 21 who had caught the attention of a warrant officer in flight medicine, who told her with the specificity of someone delivering a clinical assessment that she had the hands and the composure and the spatial intelligence to be one of the best flight medics he had ever evaluated. She had been a flight medic with the 160th SOAR 2nd Battalion. She had been on missions that do not have public records. She had performed emergency surgical interventions at altitude, in blackout conditions, with the aircraft in evasive maneuvers, with patients who were hemorrhaging in ways that would have killed most people in a well-equipped hospital, let alone a blacked-out MH-60M over mountains that didn't want you there. She had been nominated for a decoration she had been asked to decline so that the operation that earned it could stay buried. And then, in 2019, in a mountainside in eastern Afghanistan that she was not supposed to be in, because the mission had gone wrong in the way that the missions that go most wrong do, silently, completely. The aircraft hadn't been, the crew hadn't been. She had been, incompletely, against most reasonable expectations of physics and biology, but she had been, and the people who needed to account for her had accounted for her in the most expedient way, and she had let them, not because she was broken, not entirely because she was afraid, though she had been afraid, the pure animal fear of a person who had looked directly at how she might die and found it to be a small, quiet, undocumented thing in a place no one would ever visit, because staying dead was, for a long time, the only version of alive that she knew how to be. 6 years in a VA ward was not a hiding place. She would have rejected that word with the same flat patience she rejected things that were imprecise. It was a translation. She had skills that built in conditions that the civilian world did not have, and she had brought them somewhere they were needed, and she had been useful every day, in ways that were invisible. She had needed something to do with her hands that amounted to something. She had found it. But Coates was here and the salute was happening, and the ward was very quiet, and she had to make a decision in the next 3 seconds that she would be living with for the foreseeable future. She reached up and touched the badge clipped to her left pocket, the plastic edge of it, the laminated corner. She felt it the way she felt the IV nubing before she touched the port, checking, confirming, grounding in the tactile. She stood up straight, the way she stood when she was not making herself small. She did not salute back. She was a civilian. She had been a civilian for 6 years, and the conventions of that belonged to another version of herself, and she was not interested in performing a return that would be in its own way as untrue as anything else she had said this afternoon. Instead, she said quietly, and with the flat, direct certainty that was the thing most characteristic about her when she was not working to conceal it, "At ease, General." The 2 words came out of her mouth with a register she had not used since 2019. They came from the same place the not startling came from, the same place the IV placement came from, the same place the heparin flush timing and the pleural effusion catch and the medication error and every other unremarked and unrecorded thing she had done on this ward for 6 years and 3 months came from. Coates lowered his hand. He did not look at her differently. He looked at her the same way, which was to say, directly, with the particular quality of a person who has had their understanding of something fundamentally revised and is taking the time to actually sit in that revision. "You've been here 6 years, he said. 6 years and 3 months, taking care of veterans. That's the job." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who didn't know what to say. Coates was not a man who was often short of things to say, but the quiet of a man who was choosing what to say with the same care that people choose things. "There are 31 people in this ward," he said. 32 as of this morning. New admission at 0530. How many of them are you following personally right now?" "All of them," Simone said. Coates looked at her. Something in his face did what faces do when a person's model of the world updates itself and the old version has to be gently released. "Right," he said. The tour group stayed on 7 Bravo for another 31 minutes. Holt gave his presentation. Price walked the group through the new telemetry monitoring protocol. The Senate staffers asked questions about wait times. The photographer got her shots. All of this happened with the slightly altered quality of a room that has absorbed a shock and is running on the ambient energy left behind by it. Coates did not make another approach to Simone. He did not ask questions that would require answers she was not prepared to give in a public space with a Senate staffer and a photographer in attendance. He moved through the rest of the tour with the professional attentiveness of a man doing the thing he was there to do. But twice she caught him looking at her from the far end of the corridor, with the expression that she had learned to identify on the faces of men who had been in the kind of situations where someone had been between them, and the gratitude was there in the expression, but it was buried under something more complicated and more honest, which was the awareness of what it meant that she was here, and what it meant that they had let her be here without knowing it. When the tour group moved toward the elevator at 1432, Coates's aide handed Kevin a business card and said something Simone couldn't hear. Kevin looked at the card and then looked at Simone. Coates stopped at the elevator. His aide pressed the button. The other members of the group filed in. He stood in the opening and turned back to face the ward. He looked at Simone the way she had seen men look at things. They were not going to see again and were making sure they had it, the whole picture of it. The medication cart and the navy scrubs, and the harsh fluorescent light, and the ward at 1432 on a Thursday in April, all of it, the full, civilian, ordinary, unremarkable version of what she had become in 6 years and 3 months. She was standing at the medication cart, reviewing the afternoon labs. He gave a single, short nod. She gave one back. The elevator doors closed. Kevin came to find her at 1500 when the ward had reabsorbed itself, and the ordinary rhythm of a Thursday afternoon had reinstated itself in the way that hospital wards do, immediately, completely, as if the texture of the previous hour had simply been smoothed back into the ambient fabric of the place. He put the business card on the medication cart, next to her tablet. She didn't look at it. The aide said the general would like you to have that, in case you ever wanted to reach out. Kevin paused. She said he wanted you to know that 7 Bravo is lucky to have you. She used those exact words. Simone typed a note into the chart she was working on. She also said, and she said this was from him personally, she said she earned it. Kevin looked at the card and then at Simone. I'm not going to ask what that means. That's probably best, Simone said. Kevin picked up the card and looked at it for a moment, then set it back down next to her tablet. The thing with the heparin yesterday. The pleural effusion last week. The 12 things I'm probably not even aware of. He stopped. I worked here for 9 years, Bianchi. I worked with a lot of nurses. Kevin, I'm just... Kevin. Not unkind, the same tone she used to settle an anxious patient. You're going to need the 12 o'clock labs on Mr. Delgado in about 3 minutes, and the echocardiogram report for room 6 just came through, and there's something in the septal wall motion I want to show you before you go home. Kevin was quiet. Okay, he said. She worked the rest of the shift the way she always worked, her shifts completely, without excess, with the whole of her attention on the 32 people in her care, whose lives were the reason the ward existed. She caught 2 things in the afternoon labs that would have been missed until morning. She sat with a veteran in room 11 who was having a hard night for reasons that had nothing to do with his hemoglobin, because hard nights for veterans in hospitals are not always about hemoglobin. She did the medication reconciliation for the 2 discharges, and she did it right the first time, the way she always did it right the first time. At 1845, when Holt was doing his final rounds, he stopped in the doorway of the supply room where Simone was restocking the crash cart with the systematic thoroughness she brought to every task that was in any way connected to the possibility of someone dying. He looked at the cart. He looked at her hands moving through the equipment with the absolute competence that had always been there, and that he was perhaps for the first time actually registering as a thing he was watching, rather than a thing that was simply happening. The general, Holt said. He stopped, started again. He saluted you. Simone confirmed. The defibrillator pads were within date. Yes, he's a 3-star general. He was, Simone said. Now he's a private citizen doing advocacy work. He's General Raymond Coates." "I know who he is, Marcus." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him trying to find a framework for what he had seen, and not finding one that fit the model of Bianchi that he had built over 6 years of working beside her and dismissing her. "Did you know him?" Simone closed the crash cart lid and turned the locking mechanism until she heard the click. She checked it once with 2 fingers the way she always checked it. "I did the job I was trained to do," she said, "the same as here." She picked up the restocking checklist and signed the bottom. Holt stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he said simply, "Okay," and went back to his rounds. Simone put the checklist in the bin and walked back down the corridor toward the nursing station to begin her end-of-shift notes, past the rooms of 32 people who did not know most of what she was and who she took care of completely, every day the way she had always understood that care worked, but as a thing that was real, regardless, because the patients were real, and the work was real, and the hands doing it were hers. The business card sat on the medication cart for the duration of her shift. At the end of her shift, she picked it up. General Raymond S. Coates, U.S. Army, Ret. A phone number, an email, the seal of the Veterans Advocacy Organization, clean cardstock, the color of old bone. On the back, in the deliberate angular print of a man who has signed field orders in bad light, with his hands shaking from the cold, were 3 words. "We remember you." Simone stood in the corridor of 7 Bravo at the end of a 12-hour shift with the card in her hand, and felt not the fracturing grief of it, not the guilt of it, not the complicated architecture of every decision she had made since 2019. She had already done the work of feeling those things. She had done it alone and without acknowledgement over years, in the particular silence of a person who has decided that the things that have happened to them are not a performance to give to other people. She felt instead something quieter and more durable, the specific sensation of being known without being required to explain yourself to the person who knows you. The relief of it, the lightness which she had not expected, the way a wound, once properly cleaned and dressed, stops demanding your attention and frees you to do the next thing. She put the card in the breast pocket of her scrub top. She felt it rest against the left side of her chest, over the sternum, approximately where a medic's patch would have been. She walked to the locker room. She changed into her civilian clothes, jeans, a dark gray shirt, the worn running shoes she wore home on the days she was going to run, which was most days, because running was the thing her body did when it needed to remind itself that it was still functional and whole. She pulled her hair out of the restraint she wore for the ward and let it fall, and the dark brown of it was shorter than it had been in 2019, but it was hers, and the face in the mirror above the sink was hers, and the gray eyes in the face were what they were. She was 34 years old. She was alive. She had been alive all along, in the most precise and functional sense of the word, doing the most unambiguous version of the thing she was best at in a place that needed it. The hospital parking lot was warm in the early evening, the Tampa air thick with magnolia from the stretch of landscaping along the east building, the distant sound of a siren, and then quiet. She walked to her car, and she sat in it for a moment before she started the engine. She did not look at her phone. She did not think about what came next in any large, structural sense. She thought about Mr. Delgado's echo at 0800. She thought about the patient in room 6, whose septal wall motion she had flagged, and who would need the cardiology fellow to see him tomorrow morning as early as he could be reached. She thought about the veteran in room 11 who had been having a hard night and who she would check on tomorrow, regardless of whose assignment he was, because that was how she understood the job, not as a jurisdiction, but as a responsibility. She started the car. She drove home the way she always drove home, through the evening traffic, with the window down, paying attention to what she needed to pay attention to, and releasing what she didn't. General Coates had looked at her, like someone who had been given back something he thought was gone for good. She understood that look. She knew what it meant to look at a womb site after a dressing change and find that the tissue was clean and pink and rebuilding itself the way tissue does when the body decides to continue. She was continuing. She had been continuing every day for 6 years and 3 months, in a ward full of men and women who deserved exactly that from her, and she had given it, and the giving had made something of the years that no official record had anywhere accounted for, and she was all right with that. More than all right. The card was in her pocket. She would keep it. For now, for the long and ordinary and fully alive foreseeable future, she had 32 patients. It had always been enough. If this story stayed with you, the quiet ones who carry the most, hit the like button and leave us a comment below. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. These are the people who deserve to be remembered.